You have heard about the horrors of the apartheid system in South Africa. You have heard about the way the terrible white minority stole the land from the noble savages. You have heard of the thousands of needless black deaths in that country. You have definitely heard about Saint Nelson Mandela and his travails while trying to free his people from abject poverty. Well, this program and my South African guests are ready, willing, and able to tell you the truth about South Africa, which the media has deliberately hidden from you. We will dispel all the myths and lies you have been fed and leave you with the bare facts.
Wat harte en soede en u.
Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karin Smith. Please be aware that this media is only possible with the help of your donation to keep us on air. So please go to our store and indulge in some goodies or make your best donation in order for us to keep bringing you the truth and news that the mainstream will not. Our guest today is Dr. Dan Roodt, who is speaking to us from South Africa. He's a true patriot who, like the few other South Africans who are brave enough to speak out against the repressive ANC regime, has had his life turned upside down by court cases and persecution. He has, however, refused to be beaten down and speaks and writes about the atrocities happening in South Africa. Now, this week, due to the horrors that are happening in Europe, the Islamic invasion, the rapes and the murders and the burnings that are happening there, and the fact that so many USA governors have refused to take Syrian refugees, it seemed appropriate for us to speak this week about the parallels between South Africa, Europe, and even the USA. So without further ado, here is our guest. Welcome, Dan.
Hello there, Karin.
Hi, Dan. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you.
Dan, there's been so much going on this week. In fact, in the last couple of months, it's really hard to keep up. But we talk about a genocide happening in South Africa and the supposed horrors of apartheid. Well, given what's happening today, it would appear that apartheid was not such a bad choice after all. So can we start off by asking, how did blacks become a majority in South Africa?
Well, they became a majority through two processes. The one was the fact that they had very rapid population growth. I think it's recorded somewhere in the Encyclopedia of Britannica around the turn of the 20th century, when there were only about 1 million blacks in South Africa, and today there are 40 million plus Indians and coloreds and so on. The black population in South Africa has been multiplied by 40 within about a century. And the second one was through immigration. We've had, because of the prosperity created in South Africa by Europeans especially over the last 150 years or so, we've attracted people from all over the continent. And that has led to the rapid diminution of the percentage of whites of the total population. And that has, of course, parallels today in Europe and in the United States, because we're seeing now how there's this growing migration towards the Northern Hemisphere from the South, and especially from Africa and the Middle East in Europe. And, we've got Mexican immigration and South American immigration into the United States. So to my mind, you're going to see exactly the same process taking place in both North America and in Europe.
Yes, Dan, I have been told that there was a 920% growth in the black population in the last century. But during that same time, there was a lessening of the white population for many reasons. Could we discuss that as well? Because I feel it's very important for white people to understand how they are going to be, not just by breeding, by the whites having fewer children, but for other reasons as well, why we are going to be so soon outnumbered by these people that are invading us.
Well, of course, we didn't have enough immigration into South Africa for a long time, and then we've also had the internecine struggles between Afrikaners and British in South Africa, and especially the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, which was a little bit similar to perhaps the American Civil War, where we slaughtered each other, and also where, Britain interned all our women and children in concentration camps, and an entire generation of children was actually killed in those camps. So that is also, by some calculations, we would have been a nation as big as that of Sweden or maybe even the Netherlands today if it hadn't been for those concentration camps. So I think we can also blame ourselves for, and especially Britain, for having brought this upon us and having lost so many people at that time. And then currently, of course, we are losing people to emigration to Australia, New Zealand, the USA, and Canada, and so on, because a lot of people see what's happening in South Africa and they see the violence and they experience it, and they'd rather uproot themselves with their families and so on than try and stand together and find some sort of solution for our problem.
But
and of course we among the white population, it's been typically the same profile as our demographic profile is more or less the same as in the USA or Europe, where we've had relatively few children, say families of 2 children and so on, or even fewer. And I want to talk a little bit later about what we're seeing in terms of the influence of political correctness and so on. But we've also seen a rise of homosexuality and attacks on the identity of white heterosexual males and so on. And I think that also has an influence on our ability to reproduce.
Absolutely, because 2 men cannot make babies and 2 women cannot make babies. But this seems to be the norm today, that these people are acceptable, in fact, more acceptable than heterosexual people. They have more, or are being given more rights. And it seems to me an absolute recipe for killing out the race. It doesn't seem that we can survive if this is being thrust upon us so fast and in such big numbers.
Yes, exactly. And that, of course, also creates even more divisions among the European or the white population, because now we are, quarreling amongst ourselves and between heterosexual people and homosexual people and men and women. You've also seen the rise of feminism and all that entails. And, in South Africa, until about 20 years ago, we were relatively free of these things, but now it's become we've become almost a caricature of a politically correct society, and it's even in our constitution that there should be kind of a movement against racism and sexism and so on. So, the especially the white heterosexual male is definitely on the defensive. He's being assailed from all sides, and you've got certain people in the media and columnists and people who appear on TV, chat, talk shows and so on, who are constantly saying nasty things about men, and especially white men, and that we are the source,
of all
the root of
evil.
all, the root of all evil. Yes,
Absolutely, all of it. Dan, for me, it's fairly shocking because every single movie you watch, whether it is a science fiction or a serious movie, you have this in your face all the time. They're teaching it in the schools here. For me, it is absolutely shocking because my generation, which is yours as well, we understood who we were and what our place in the family was. The man was the head of the house. What he said went. He went out and earned a living. The woman stayed at home, cleaned the house, raised the kids, was the Volvo driving soccer mom, and that was her job. And we all understood our place in society. Not a class type of thing, but we were secure in ourselves because that is what we did. Now, nobody knows who they are, what is expected of them. And on top of all the other things going wrong in this world, if you don't know who you are, how do you know how to behave?
yes, exactly. I think we've seen that kind of evolution or even a revolution since the 1950s in most Western societies, because in the 50s, women were largely not employed, or they were just intermittently employed, and they raised children and they worked in charities and so on, and they fulfilled a very important function in society. And then suddenly there was this notion that they had to also become part of the job market and be subjected to all the stresses of working life, and with that, the upbringing of children suffered, and you also had the rise of this ideology that came with it, which was feminism, and that preached that women should be equal to men in all respects, and should even be conscripted into the military and be made, be exposed to all the dangers of war, stresses of war, and be fighter pilots and who knows what.
It's an essential function of the man, which was to protect his women and his family, has been eroded by that, don't you think?
Yes, exactly. Because the people who are able to fulfill that protective role, they are now being excluded from most of those kind of jobs. You see, even in Europe, there are quite a few countries, including France and Sweden, who have women as ministers of defense, which is quite surprising, because you normally associate the military with the male of the species. And one wonders whether women sometimes are able to take to employ this kind of military logic there that men have had at their disposal for hundreds and even thousands of years. Women have a different way of operating.
Well,
And at times it might be advantageous, but at times it might also create unforeseen risks. And, if you see Mrs. Merkel's decision now to simply throw open the borders of Europe to all these migrants from North Africa and the Middle East, perhaps if she'd been a man and had that sort of responsibility, been more conscious of her responsibility as a protector, she wouldn't have so easily have taken such a drastic and far-reaching decision.
Absolutely, Dan, because women are supposed to be the nurturers, the kind, the soft half of humanity. And I don't think that we have the Constitution. I don't think that we are built that way to be hard. So it is more natural for a woman to say, oh, shame the poor refugees that they're suffering, give them a new home, than it is for a man, because the man would look at the dangers coming with them. And there are huge dangers that they are bringing into Europe.
Yes, exactly. I think possibly, a male politician, although there are also very dubious male politicians around, but he might have been more inclined to look at a logical analysis of the problem instead of putting the emotional aspect up front, as she has done, saying that these are poor suffering people and we should simply welcome them into our hearts and into our homes and into our countries. So,
if you look at that invasion of them, there are so few women and children. It is mainly young, fit, well dressed, with cell phones, men.
yes, exactly. I think a lot of commentators have actually drawn attention to that these migrants coming into Europe are actually not the weak and the vulnerable, but they are young men of military age who are able to, you know, possibly could cause severe problems in Europe. And I think generally speaking, you know, young men are, when left unto their own devices, they tend to cause problems. Here in South Africa, of course, we've seen this kind of youth bulge in the black population, and it's been associated with violence and a lot of riots. And we're already seeing that happening in Europe. There are lots and lots of riots taking place, lots of violence, crime, and so on. So the South African experience, what we've seen here over the last few decades, is being replicated in Europe almost to the T.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because the rape and looting and burning that is happening as we speak in Europe is frightening. But we in South Africa have had that going for years.
Oh, yes. I mean, there's almost not a day that goes by in South Africa without some form of riot taking place. Even the police here, they stated quite openly that I think every day in South Africa there are about 15 protests taking place all over the country, and at least two or three of them turn into public violence. So, and they would be looting and burning and so on. Currently, we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Several of the universities have been closed down. I spoke the other day to a professor down at the University of the Western Cape, and he says that the riots they've seen there are the worst ever, even worse than the ones they had in the 1980s, when a lot of the countries outside South Africa and Europe and so on were actually doing their best to foment revolution and violence in South Africa, and they were actually paying people to riot here. And it's now actually even worse than in those days. So, riots here are not really associated with a white government or a black government. They just happen all the time.
That was kind of what my next question was going to be. Is there a clash of civilizations in South Africa as in Europe? Because in Europe, these people have no idea and no will to integrate with the local population. They want the world turned into the world that they're fleeing from. Did that happen in South Africa as well?
Well, yes. I think there's a slight difference in that what we're seeing in Europe at the moment is a clash of civilizations between a more Christian or secularized civilization but with its roots in Christian values in Europe, and then the incoming Middle Eastern Islamic culture, and it's just so obvious if you read the European press and reports and so on that every day there are conflicts around the different worldviews of these two cultures. It concerns the place of women in society, whereas in Islamic culture, of course, the woman is very much inferior to the man, and she has to obey him in all respects, and she also has to clothe herself modestly and wear the veil and the hijab or the burqa even, and at the same time, due to this kind of rise of feminism in European society, European women would see themselves as very much the equals of men. So the irony, of course, now is that these radical feminists who are anti the white males, they don't express any form of criticism over this misogynistic, male chauvinist culture that the Islamic people have brought with them into Europe, which is one of the paradoxes, of course, of political correctness, that it only tends to criticize European culture, not any other culture. In South Africa, on the other hand, it's been very much a clash between European culture and African culture, which is almost worse because there are various aspects of African culture that are even more irrational than than the Muslim culture. You've got superstition and forms of sacrifice, and we even had in some parts of the country we had human sacrifice in the 19th century. So and there's actually a story I want to relate to you a little bit later about when we talk about how segregation came about in South Africa, where in the early 1950s, an Irish-born nun was not only killed by blacks in South Africa, but she was also cannibalized. Now, you don't see those extreme forms of cultural clash nowadays in Europe. You perhaps see it in the form of terrorism and so on, like we've seen in Paris now with the killings at the Bataclan music theater and other places. But these things that are almost monstrous, like cannibalism, we haven't seen much of that yet in Europe. But in South Africa, over the last 200 years, we've been, we've almost become used to extreme and bizarre occurrences where you just confront it with another culture that is so foreign and very hard to understand.
We've become almost desensitized, haven't we? Because the onslaught on the whites in South Africa has gone on for so long, my whole lifetime, literally, that you become desensitized. You can't look at it anymore. You can't feel it anymore. Where it would have moved you to tears and hysteria at an earlier stage of your life. Nowadays, it's just, oh, well, another day in South Africa. But the Europeans are not prepared for this because they haven't lived with these people all their lives.
Yes, I think that has its pros and cons, because I think, well, one thing that's positive at the moment is that at least some people in Europe do react to the violence taking place there, and they are quite shocked by it. Whereas sometimes I feel in South Africa we've lost the capacity to be shocked by anything. If 50 people get murdered every day in South Africa, and we seem to live with that. We don't really. It's nothing to write home about. And if you hear about somebody who's been attacked, or some young girl got mugged yesterday, we consider that to be so normal that it's it's like somebody telling you, "Oh, I went shopping yesterday and I bought a new pair of shoes." There's almost no difference in the emotional value attached to incidences of violence and just other normal everyday events. So we have become, as you say, desensitized to violence and crime and extreme events, which is very negative. And I wish we could again develop that capacity to be shocked and to be upset by murder and rape and injustice that we experience almost all the time.
Yeah.
It also goes together with a sense of, if you are white, then you have to accept being a second-class citizen. If there are racial quotas being imposed, oh well, then you make do with it, or you try and find another way to do business, or to get into university, or to get a job, because you are white, and you accept that therefore you are sort of in a way handicapped, and you've just got to live with that. You're like a person who hasn't got any legs, and you just you have to come to terms with that and accept it, and then you're not going to compete against the able-bodied people in what they do every day, and therefore we accept that there are we're a separate class of people. We are the whites, and therefore we cannot aspire to um, to certain jobs, or it's more difficult for us to get into university. We sometimes get paid less money, and of course we have a lesser say as to what happens to our taxes, or what happens in our schools. At the current moment, some court has just taken away the rights of parents and associations at schools to actually have a say in what's going on in those schools. That has all now been given to the government, which is mostly, of course, a black government.
Yeah. And that leads me into this, because, Dan, what you're describing about the white people situation in South Africa is how the world understands it was under apartheid for the blacks. They understand that they were second-class citizens. They did not have the same access to the things that white had. So then, why was there apartheid or segregation? I hate that word apartheid, because the way it's said in the rest of the world is apart and hate. Which is not what it means at all. It means separateness, and it is exactly the same as segregation was here in the USA. But somehow segregation doesn't have the same negative connotations that apartheid has. So why did we have apartheid?
Well, I think, as you say quite rightly, apartheid, the roots of apartheid was simply in a kind of a separate but equal philosophy that you also had in the United States. But to my mind, it arose, almost spontaneously throughout South African history. I mean, if you read some of these left-wing histories of South Africa, they also say it goes right back to 1652 when the first 3 Dutch ships arrived in the Cape in South Africa to create the first European settlement there. For them, I think the president of South Africa, Mr. Jacob Zuma, also said a few weeks ago or a few months ago that our problems started when the whites arrived in South Africa. So they tend to see the beginnings of so-called apartheid with the arrival of Europeans in South Africa. But the notion that there should be a separation of the different cultures, I think that over the centuries that developed more or less spontaneously, and especially through the experiences of violence and what you might term barbarism that the early settlers were confronted with, especially when they moved into the interior of the country in the 19th century, and there were various massacres which led to battles between whites and blacks, and that is sort of established the need for keeping the cultures separate from one another, and even having some form of geographical separation. And that's how the so-called tribal homelands came about. And then there was a white part of South Africa and all these various other ethnic homelands that were eventually institutionalized by the National Party government after 1948. But it even started in, I think the first tribal area that got self-rule or home rule, as they call it in the UK, when the island got home rule, they got it in about 1895 under Cecil John Rhodes in the Cape. The Transkei, or the Xhosa homeland, got their first parliament, the so-called Bunga, and they started ruling themselves from that time onwards. But when you're looking at the urban areas, I think the need for some form of separateness arose especially in the early 1950s when, when paradoxically the Second World War also created an influx of blacks into the urban areas, because all the white men, or a significant number of them, went abroad to actually fight in the war on the side of the Allies, and there was that created a shortage of labor in the cities, and the factory owners and the businesses, they started to employ some of the black men to do those jobs, and that caused a tremendous migration to the cities and created shanty towns and so on around the cities where a lot of these blacks lived. And some of them, in some areas, there was also a peculiar kind of economy that came about as a result in the early 1950s, where most of the black men coming in from the tribal areas, they had no skills whatsoever, so they couldn't actually sell their labor in the towns and cities, and they and the only two jobs, if you could call it that, were done by the women, and they were either servants, domestic servants in white households, or they were prostitutes in the black locations, as they used to be called at the time. And this, I actually read a history paper written by two liberal academics about that, and especially about conditions just outside the city of East London in the Eastern Cape. at the time, and that and the conditions is also regarding crime and violence in those black locations then also boiled over into riots. And there was one such a riot in 1952 just outside East London where this Irish born nun called Elsie Quinlan was attacked and then her body was eaten by the rioters. And the shock of that kind of event uh, convinced the government that they should also spatially separate the different cultures and have blacks living in their own areas and Indians in their own areas and coloreds, mixed race people in their areas and then whites in other areas. And for a while I think that did calm things down, and South Africa in the 1960s had actually a very successful economic run. It was one of the highest, apart from Japan, I think we had the highest growth rate in the world. But then from the 1970s onwards, and specifically as a result of external interference and the role of East Germany and the Soviet Union and some of the more liberal and left-wing governments in the West, they again, stirred up conflict in South Africa, and say they even supported urban terrorism here. Ironically, there's an outcry today over terrorism in Europe and the kinds of events that we've seen in Paris, where civilians are simply slaughtered like that. But in fact, not so long ago, the socialist government of France, the same socialist party that's governing the country at the moment, or the Labour Party in Holland, or the Labour Party in the UK, and the Social Democrats in Sweden, they were actually donating money to urban terrorists in South Africa. So that's, for us, we see this kind of moral ambivalence in the world, and it's very hard for us to fathom it, because it seems that what's wrong in Europe is right in South Africa, and we seem to bear the brunt of everyone else's hostility.
Yes, yes. But one also needs to stress the fact that the black tribes are not one tribe who love each other. There are 11 and more black tribes in South Africa who indulge in interracial murder and mayhem at the drop of a hat. So it's not, it made sense to separate them from each other as well as from the whites.
Yes, exactly. You're quite right. In our, even most recently in 2008 and even at the beginning of this year, we had so-called xenophobic riots where local blacks just kill other Africans from Zimbabwe, from the countries around us, who are either mostly illegal immigrants in South Africa. They actually just attack them randomly and kill them and so on. In 2008, they killed about 80 of them. None of them were actually charged with murder or anything like that. Our government just looked the other way. But among the tribes themselves, yes, especially in the 19th century, there were internecine wars, and there was a kind of a black genocide going on, which was eventually then brought under control by the white pioneers, and that's another reason why there was such a population explosion afterwards, because the existing internecine violence among the tribes was brought to a halt. And but we still have ethnic conflict to a certain extent among black tribes, and there's also been ethnic conflict in South Africa between Indians and blacks, for example, in Natal, in the 1940s and 50s, there were various incidents like that where the Zulus would turn on the Indians and go and slaughter them. So it's been part of, the South African government or the previous white governments in South Africa, they had their hands full in managing such a complex society with all these ethnic issues going on all the time. And I think, notwithstanding our bad reputation in the world, we did a fairly good job over much of the 20th century. There wasn't any form of a war on South African soil, unlike in Europe at the time, and we were spared the sort of really deadly ethnic conflicts that you saw and kind of genocides that you had elsewhere on the African continent, the upheavals, economic collapse, and so on that went with that. And we prospered for most of the 20th century. But somehow, in the eyes of the outside world, that was seen in a very negative light. And we, among all societies on the planet, we were the one singled out for punishment and for calumny and boycotts and sanctions and so on. People wouldn't even play sport against us. They spat. They literally, these left-wing protesters literally spat on our diplomats in various public places or processions in various countries. They threw glass on the sports fields in New Zealand where our sports teams were supposed to play. So we were singled out as the scapegoat in the world for having, I don't know, for the existence of ethnic and racial diversity in the world, whereas we didn't create it. It came about through evolution or by the hand of God, but we didn't create different cultures and races and so on, and we did a fairly good job of managing such social complexity, but somehow we were made into the scapegoats for that. And I think it's time to come out and say that, especially now that for the first time, some of the Western countries, especially in Europe, are experiencing the shock of cultural differences.
Absolutely.
And they're going to experience it more and more going forward, and then they'll start appreciating what we've been dealing with here over the last 100, 200 years.
Well, that leads me into the next question, Dan, because as you've just said, the world turned on white South Africa as if we were some kind of man-eating beasts, and we are portrayed that way. Even today, if you say you're a South African, the immediate thing is you're racist. I mean, it's unbelievable, the picture that they have of us. So could you give us some examples of where whites are victims of violence and crime by the blacks? Because as far as I can see, there is minimal white on black crime in South Africa. It's black on black or black on white. So could you give us some examples of black on white? Because it's extremely violent, the crimes they commit.
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, the South African whites are, I think they're probably some of the most benign people in the world. In Australia, apparently up until about 1976, you could get, you could buy a license, to go and shoot an Aboriginal. And we know that in the US, they dealt in a fairly cruel manner with a lot of the Indians. And they even, distributed blankets carrying smallpox Germans and so on to Indians. In most of North America, the Aboriginal population was more or less wiped out. Even the British in the 1950s, apparently they killed about 57,000 Kenyans, just prior to Kenyan independence. So, we've never killed people on such a scale. Wherever we kind of we killed a few thousand blacks was in some sort of a battle, and after they at first committed a series of massacres against us. It seems that we only really start reacting when thousands or hundreds of our own people get killed. Then we start kind of reacting and maybe purely in self-defense.
Yes.
So, but looking at South African history a little, of course, one can cite various instances of this kind of black on white violence, but notoriously, I think you're looking at, say, 1838, when the first pioneers came across the mountains, so-called Drakensberg Mountains, and they were camping next to the Tugela River there in Natal, and trying to negotiate about land with a Zulu chief. And then the next thing, and there was this famous incident where Peter Retief, the leader of the so-called Voortrekkers, was told by the Zulu chief to leave their guns outside the kraal or the village of the Zulus, which they then did, being trusting, nice people that they were. And then 80 of them got massacred. Retief's son was tortured and killed in front of his very own eyes, and he was eventually atrociously slaughtered by Zulus. And then the Zulus sent out their warriors to go and massacre about 500 women and children camping next to the river there. And it was only after that that the Battle of Blood River took place, where we then, scored a great victory over thousands and thousands. Only 450 of us beat about 10 to 20,000 Zulus at the time. And then here in the early 1860s, there was another incident where a hunting party under, I think it was Adrian Potgieter in the northern Transvaal. There were about 18 people, and they were attacked by some black tribe and completely massacred, and they actually skinned the leader alive. They tortured him to death and skinned him alive. And after that, there was a battle outside a cave, because the local chief, his name was Makapan, and this Makapan's cave is sort of inscribed in the annals of South African history, because there was then a battle outside the cave. And then, the farmers and the burghers, the men up there, they punished this tribe and shot quite a few of them. And but lo and behold, when this new government came to power, one of the first things that they did was actually to change the name of the town, which was founded in the 19th century and named after the Potgieter brothers, the one who died, and also his brother, who then was part of the military response to that murder. And they named it after this chief who skinned this hunter and his party alive, which shows you that how the blacks and this black government, they identify with these people from the past. They're people who committed all these atrocities against white people. And then, of course, during the Anglo-Boer War, the British employed lots of blacks as kind of auxiliary troops, and they specifically told them to go and rape the white women. and which is one of the reasons why there was such a revulsion against kind of mixed race or racial mixing, especially in the north of the country, because it was associated with the war and with these rapes that were taking place on a substantial scale during the war. And I've already referred to this case of the nun who actually worked among the blacks in that black area, and was really dedicated to educating them and healing them and so on. And she was then, when this riot took place, Elsie Quinlan, she was attacked in a car, dragged from the car, stabbed to death, and then eaten, fried and eaten by the very people she was helping. And there was another, during the 1976 riots, there's this photograph that was taken by a black photographer of the 12-year-old schoolboy who sort of wandered into the line of fire and then got shot dead. But the day before, a Jewish doctor, Dr. Melville Edelstein, who had also spent his life in that black ghetto healing people, he was one of the first people to be murdered. And, and since then we've had, of course, tremendous, ever since this government came to power, we've had tremendous atrocities and crimes being committed, whole families wiped out. There was that incident in Pretoria where a baby girl of 1-year-old Kayla Rawsthorne was shot to death on her first birthday together with her mother and her grandmother. Her entire family was wiped out. You've got families on farms killed and people tortured to death for hours. There's a kind of a sadism at work in South Africa that nobody has really described yet, but it's that nobody has properly analyzed. And I've even spoken to medical people and psychiatrists and so on, and they tell me that the academics in this country, they don't dare to publish any form of analysis or of the facts or trying to come up with explanations for all of this violence, because they would just be shouted down as racists. But there's a big job here to do just to try and even scratch the surface of what's going on and trying to understand it and to give explanations for it. Where does it come from? Why does it happen?
Yes, because, Dan, you would think that a race of people that has been exposed to Western civilization and lived amongst us, lived in our homes. I mean, the maids in South Africa generally have a room on your property. So they live amongst you. They I don't know about today, but they used to be, when the mother went out, the maid looked after the children. They were part of the family. You cannot understand how people who have had hundreds of years of exposure to the Western, gentler way of life can still exhibit. Oh, we're going into an ad break. We'll be back in 6 minutes. Welcome back to Radio Free South Africa. I'm your host, Karin Smith, and our guest today is Dr. Dan Roodt, who is speaking to us from South Africa. So, Dan, we were talking about the violence that seems to be natural in the Black culture, and how it hasn't changed since the 1600s, and I don't understand it.
Yes, that's what we're all trying to understand, and as I said previously, the academics in South Africa, the people who are paid actually to sit around at universities and study certain social phenomena, they're not underwriting about this at all, or even trying to analyze it. So it's up to us to try and make sense of it. But I mentioned one or two those incidents. I might mention, just to give people an idea of what we're dealing with here, two other incidents. I mean, there was this one incident that was reported on in 2012, wherein on 1 October 2011, an entire family of Portuguese descent here in South Africa was massacred by three young black males. They actually shot the father, then they raped the mother, all three of them together, and there was a 12-year-old boy. Afterwards, they realized that he might recognize them, so then they actually gagged him and drowned him in a tub of boiling hot water. So this kind of torture and killing and bloodlust that we're seeing here, it's really, it's so shocking that it defies belief. And then also about a year ago or so, there was a court case, on in Pretoria where, and we don't know the girl's name, but there was a young student at the University of Pretoria, a white student, white Afrikaans-speaking student, and she's a Christian, and she'd gone to a Bible study class, and then she got in the area where she lives. It's kind of a gated community where she lives, and then she went back home, and as she got home at about 10 o'clock at night, the place was broken into by another young black criminal who was out on bail after having committed another crime, and then he cut her up with a knife, and while she was bleeding to death, he actually raped her, and then she crawled, bleeding and almost dying, on the way to a neighbor who eventually could help her, and they saved her life, but she had to have substantial surgery and so on. Her face was scarred for life, and she was traumatized, for life. And when he was up on the stand, this young black criminal, he said, well, I forgave you for apartheid. You should forgive me, and the court should forgive me for what I done to you. Well, fortunately, there was still a white judge, and he actually sent him to prison for 40 years. But there's no longer any death penalty in South Africa. He should have got the death penalty for what he did. But these sorts of incidents take place all the time, and people are really terrorized, and especially, of course, on the farms, where up to 4,000 of our farmers have already been killed, and many of them also tortured to death. And they use hot irons to burn people and humiliate them and so on. So it seems to me that part of this kind of primitive culture that was subdued by the coming of Western civilization to this country has now been let loose again, and it's because we've lost power, or we've been made to surrender by the other Western countries, and in the place of this kind of benign rule that we applied here, we've now got a situation where these sort of primitive urges and propensity for violence and torture and sadism are have been cut free, and is being let loose again. So the effect on the world of all of this is going to be devastating. And if you read all those science fiction stories about the return to the Dark Ages, yeah, I mean,
Well on
where
its
else are
way.
we going to go if we allow this kind of thing to continue?
But Dan, we're not just allowing it. The government of South Africa seems to be encouraging it because these things are called normal crime. Now, what is normal about any of the things that you have described to us?
Yeah, nothing's normal, and there's also a definite, to a lot of these killings, there's a definite sort of ethnic genocidal element to it because they simply want to get rid of the whites in this country. It's happened in other African countries. Up in Zimbabwe, they've simply there were about 300,000 whites in that country, and they simply drove them out, drove them across the border or into exile, and they more or less gone. I mean, there are about 10,000 of them left, living under very severe conditions. And some of the elderly people who are stuck there, one really pities them. But there's a definite sense that they don't want us here anymore, even though it's our country. We built it, we created the jewel of Africa, with its economy and if you look at uh, our farms and houses and the infrastructure that we've created here, at one time and probably still have more roads and railways than the United Kingdom. And all of that we've created here, and they've simply taken it over and appropriated it, and they consider it their own, and we are now interlopers and foreigners that should be gotten rid of.
That at the same time, which is also a very, very strange paradigm to me, is that they do not want the white people, but they want all the benefits of Western society.
Yes, I was actually thinking the other day that one of the things I want to do is just make a short YouTube video of how some of these, I would call them beneficiaries of affirmative action and government posts and so on, how they are living here in Johannesburg. If you see somebody driving around in $100,000 or $200,000 car in some sort of Italian or German sports car or a big Mercedes 4x4, those sorts of cars, 8 times out of 10, it's a black person behind the steering wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And if we could only show the world outside, how these people live, while they are themselves saying they are victims, and they are so-called victims of white privilege, or they've been disadvantaged. That's the term that's used here. They're previously disadvantaged. How on earth are they disadvantaged? They are living like European aristocrats in the 18th century, having orgies and parties and spending the spending the state's coffers and the municipal budgets as if it belonged to them. So how on earth should we see them as victims? It's very hard for me to understand. But it seems that people in North America and in Europe, they still see them as victims because they were supposedly oppressed by white South Africans in days gone by. Whereas if you look at the history, I mean, they were more oppressed by their black brothers than by any white person ever.
Exactly. And still to this day, there are the elites who have benefited, but the huddled masses, which get bigger by the hour, have not benefited one bit from this ANC-created democracy.
Yes, unemployment in South Africa has gone up from maybe about 10% or so to the current. Depends what measure you use, but it's anything between 25 and 40%, and the youth unemployment is above 50%. These young black men who come out of the schools, they've got no hope of finding a job. So, even apart from this kind of seemingly natural propensity to commit crime and violence, there are also socioeconomic reasons why they are committing so much crime, because they are jobless, and this government, I don't think, has created a single job, even though they make these grandiose kind of pompous announcements all the time where they're going to create 6 million jobs in 5 years and that sort of thing, but it never happens. And they were actually much better off under the previous governments in South Africa, because then the educational system was better, the health system was better, and there was a certain, and the people in government at least had some sense of responsibility, whereas our current ruling class, as I say, they're just driving around in their expensive cars and going to parties and living in 5-star hotels. I mean, they've all been, there are so many scandals in South Africa where some black politician would sort of just live in a 5-star hotel for a year or two, funded by the taxpayer, because his house happens to be redecorated, or he lives in some other province and he rules in another, so then he has to live in a hotel one part of for a certain amount of time, and at home for another period. It's completely absurd, and there's so much wastage going on, and profligacy,
Fraud and corruption.
corruption. Oh yes, I mean, the corruption is just amazing. It's just totally amazing, and the newspapers write about these things, but it's only the tip of the iceberg, and it doesn't shock anyone anymore.
No.
And in Europe still, and I think in the United States, somebody would at least lose his job, or there would be such a scandal after being found out to have robbed the public purse, stolen from the public purse, or embezzled money and so on. But over here, the worst that ever happens is that the politician who has been fingered as being a criminal and having committed fraud and so on, he would leave the one post and then just go to another one in another province or something like that. He would just be redeployed by the ruling party, and that's the end of it, and they never get prosecuted. They don't even have to pay the money back. I mean, our president is until recently, he was charged with about 700 different instances of corruption, and through using certain clever lawyers and having, of course, the entire state apparatus at his disposal, he has actually quashed the entire thing, and he's come off scot-free.
And richer than Croesus.
Yes, and his son is supposed to be a billionaire, so his son does business with the government. I mean, that's actually something that's very common in South Africa, is that you say the husband is some sort of mayor of a city or something, then his wife would do business with the city or his close family, and they've got all sorts of proxies and trusts and heaven knows what, where they're just tapping into the flows of money from government, and it seems to me that has been the major object of the entire revolution in South Africa, is to actually get into business with government and to pillage all the resources and reserves, built up over the past 300 or 400 years. You see it especially in the public companies as well that are all uh, bankrupt now. Like the South African Airways, Eskom, Telkom, all of the post office, even all of those institutions are just about bankrupt, and they have to be recapitalized all the time by the taxpayer and the people who supposedly manage them. They live Hollywood lives. They drive Hollywood cars, they live in Hollywood mansions, while they simply running these institutions into the ground.
So then, Dan, my question is, did the abolition of segregation or this apartheid, did it lead to equality between the races and cultures? Because it doesn't look like it.
No, not at all. There was actually, when I studied at university, I did Latin as well, and we had a Latin professor at the time who studied at one point at Cambridge. I think he had a PhD in Latin from Cambridge University in England. And he also wrote a book in the late 70s called South Africa After Forster. And Forster was, of course, the prime minister in the 1970s. And I think his argument in that book was that South Africa there were only two options for South Africa. It was either white domination or black domination. And, to some extent, I think we have to admit that prior to 1994, there was some form of white domination, even though it was not as absolute as the outside world was making it out to be. But let's admit that there was some form of white domination.
Uh-huh.
And under such a system, you could also call it minority rule, but it was a minority rule with tolerance, and it was fairly rational, and it was benign. Whereas now we have another form of minority rule where we've got a black oligarchy ruling and pillaging the country, but it's a minority rule without tolerance. It's intolerant of other cultures, and especially people of European descent and European culture. It's completely intolerant towards us, and it's not benign. It's an evil form of government. It's motivated by criminal instincts, and it's actually just institutionalized crime, really. And in fact, there was quite a scandal a few days ago when the president of the country was literally dining with some gangsters down in the Cape. And I think one of the effects of the ANC takeover of South Africa has been that organized crime is now very much it's found a haven in South Africa with money laundering and so on. Our banking system is being used for that, and I think there's just such a lot of crime happening in South Africa, and it's also organized crime. So yeah, that's what we've got now. And the ordinary, the voter out there, he will never change the system, because the people at the top are appointed. They're actually still tribally appointed. That's what people don't realize, is that the top positions now are still being determined by African tribal customs and clans and family structures, extended family structures, and so on. So in it's not a Western-style democracy at all. I mean, the facade is that, and we go to the polls every 5 years, but everything is preordained. It's all rigged before whoever, that entire class of people who govern the country. They are not appointed by democratic means at all. Um, they are. We've gone right back to the early 19th century, or even before that, when we had the rule by autocratic chiefs in the country, and we still got a kind of a Bantu aristocracy now ruling the country, and unfortunately, I cannot see how the system is sustainable in the long run, because all of this must, the resources will be depleted at some point. And even, water and electricity, all of that are running out because they haven't spent a cent on maintenance of the, on various electricity power stations and the water system. There are big concerns around water in South Africa now because this is a very dry country. I mean, Johannesburg is a huge city, and there's no major river near it. So we're actually pumping water from hundreds of miles from here, from the Lesotho highlands and from the Vaal Dam and so on, and our entire water system is being polluted because the sewage is not being properly treated. So we are really in for a rough ride going forward.
And given the drought, of course, that you've suffered, and the deaths of all the farmers, and then, of course, the land claims against the farmers, the situation does not look good at all.
No, you've got, of course, you got the influence of all the old communist ideology that land should be nationalized, land should be turned over to the workers. You've got that playing a role, and it's definitely going to lead to some form of food crisis in South Africa within the next 5 or 10 years. That's for sure. And then there will be even more riots and violence going on in the country.
Dan, do you honestly think 5 years? I'm looking at the shortage of food now, the blood coming out of the taps because it's not being, the water is not being correctly dealt with, the bacteria growing in your rivers and dams and your water supplies, the sheer numbers of black people still flowing into the country from all the countries around you. And I'm wondering, do we have 5 years before everything crumbles? Look like it.
Yes, probably not. But I'm sometimes amazed by the fortitude of these farmers and people trying to make the system work. You can still go to the shop and buy more or less what you need, although the prices have been slowly creeping up, and of course our currency is now weaker than it's ever been. So anything imported is becoming hugely expensive. So it could happen sooner. I grant you that it could happen sooner, but with certainty, almost with certainty, we can say that within the next 5 or 10 years there is going to be a huge crisis here.
And the problem is the infrastructure, the roads, the railways, everything has kind of limped along under its own, because it was so well built and maintained previously. But now, after 21 years, it is unable to limp along under its own control anymore. So everything is falling apart. Absolutely everything. So given that, and given 50% of the youth who are unemployed, hopeless, idle, and turning to crime, the situation there is just going to get worse. So, given that example, it does not seem that a multicultural society is possible anywhere in the world.
Yes, I would agree with you there because, we referred previously to this idea of the clash of civilizations. You cannot have two sets of rules. In a country, there has to be one set of laws that's universally applicable. I mean, you can't have one set of rules for one branch of people and another set for another. It leads just to contradictions and to the system breaking down completely. I mean, we see this in some of our hospitals where in some areas where they're still applying Western medicine, and in other areas there's sort of the African traditional, so-called traditional healing creeping in, where they don't actually cure people, but they make them feel slightly better by giving them some sort of concoction, um, or you know, um, dealing in spells and sort of throwing the bones and that sort of thing. So you've got to have something that's more consistent than that. And if you have two completely contradictory systems, it just doesn't work. It just leads to a huge amount of conflict, and it's every day you're struggling with that. And people are dissatisfied, and everybody's unhappy. And I'm afraid that sort of system is coming for Europe, and it's probably coming for the United States as well. I think we see a lot of the racial problems also boiling over in the US. It's kind of aided and abetted by political correctness.
Mm-hmm.
We also see it at the US universities. Um, we had this whole incident around the University of Missouri where somebody uttered the N word, and the next moment the president of the university had to resign. Those sorts of problems are just going to get worse and worse unless we can snap out of the current mindset and start solving the problems and start taking a stand on some of these issues.
Yeah, you're talking about US universities, but there has been a crisis this year in South Africa in the university.
Yes, exactly. It's almost ridiculous the way it started, and it's still going on because, at the beginning of the year, you had an incident where a supposed student, a black student, what's his name, Chimani Makwele, he threw human waste, or what people call human waste or excrement, at a statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. And, instead of people just ignoring that, or, giving him, some disciplinary hearing or something like that, the university actually caved in and removed the statue. And that was then seen as a major victory for this crowd of black nationalist students who want South Africa to become just another African country and to be purified of its Western heritage. And from there on, it escalated towards the end of the year. Now we've had several universities closing completely. At the University of the Western Cape, which is a mainly black and coloured university, as I mentioned before, they're not even writing exams. The entire university is closed. No one is allowed on the campus for fear of more violence breaking out. They've already caused millions of rands of damage there through rioting. They burnt parts of the university down. At some of the other universities, exams had to be postponed. There have also been riots on the campuses and all kinds of radical demands being made. You had television debates around it. At the University of Cape Town, about 90% of the professors are still white because there aren't any black academics with the necessary qualifications to take their place. So, but now there's a demand for quotas to be applied and for just anybody to be appointed, as a professor at the university, simply to fill these racial quotas. And in South Africa, of course, they call this process transformation. So everything now has to be transformed and to become more African. And they're even talking about all our universities should become African, and we should only study African. All the subjects should have an African content. Now, in mathematics, Africans haven't contributed anything to the subject of mathematics or to physics or computer science, anything like that. So, how on earth are they going to give those subjects an African content? But they're absolutely adamant that the content of the courses have to be African.
But the African didn't even have a written language. They don't have words in their languages for technology or any Western concepts. So how could that possibly be? It couldn't be possible to do this.
No, it's not possible. And I know in some of the languages here they can't even. There are no words to count beyond 10. After 10, you've got to say, it's a sort of 10 plus 1 or something like that,
Mm.
And it's just after 10, it's just many. So,
How are you going to teach maths in a language like they don't even have a word for tomorrow or for yesterday?
Yes, but now, in some of the subjects where you have, of course, political correctness imported from the USA, mainly, they are now starting to change those subjects in such a way that you actually don't study you don't have a Western content in there anymore. They talk about African philosophy, and they study this notion of Ubuntu, so-called. They no longer do Kant or Hegel or Bertrand Russell or whoever. All of that has been, fallen by the wayside or been removed from the syllabus. Even in English literature, you can now actually do English literature. I mean, you can study English at school and at university and even get a degree in it, and you would never be exposed to any British or American authors, the classical authors, like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe or any of these people. You would just read African authors writing in English. And then what's also happening is that even in courses where they say study painting and so on, they would no longer talk about the painting, but they would talk about what's wrong with the painting, because it was painted by a white painter who suffered from whiteness and the white male gaze, so-called. And all the students get indoctrinated into this kind of stuff. They have to, and when you talk about the dominant ideology in South Africa. I think there are three elements that you come across quite a lot, and we've already referred to it a little bit. The notion that the white heterosexual male is the root of all evil, and therefore whiteness. That's the buzzword at the moment. You hear it on the television and on the radio. They have radio programs about that, and white privilege goes with that, and the notion that the whole world is wrong because most of our civilization was created by white people. Therefore, there's something inherently wrong with it, and white people have to feel bad about it. They have to feel guilty. So, and they have these courses in whiteness, and people have to write exams about that, and they have to, confess as to the evil perpetrated by the white man or by people of European descent. That's the one element, and of course the other one is feminism. That's being, the notion that men are bad, therefore women should have more authority in society. And then the whole gay issue. In South Africa, of course, we were one of the first countries where homosexuals could marry, and where same-sex marriage was legalized by our so-called constitutional court. Nobody was consulted about it. The electorate wasn't asked their opinion. Even the blacks in this country are vociferously against same-sex marriage. If a referendum had to be held tomorrow, about 80 or 90% of the population, black and white, would vote against same-sex marriage, but it was simply imposed from above. And, within the white society and also within Afrikaner society, I think homosexuals are being used to divide people and also to corrupt us and our morals, our sense of identity. A lot of these so-called gay people have been deployed into the media and radio stations, television, and so on, and they've got a certain axe to grind against people with families and heterosexual people, and they are really going for it, and therefore they are also serving this revolution and breaking down the existing culture and replacing it with something new that is corrupted and where with very uncertain values, where you can do what you like, or
Yes.
Where there are no rules, where there's this sort of chaos and anarchy. So we're drifting towards chaos and anarchy all the time, more and more.
Oh, Dan, so then, does South Africa have a future, or more? Do the whites in South Africa have a future?
Well, I think, it's a difficult question because, it depends on so many things. But I do believe that we have a future, and even as whites, we have a future. But then we'll have to, at some point, rally together and start standing up for what we believe in. And we have to, face our adversaries, and we also have to, face up to the outside world who may want to pour calumny onto us once more. And it might also depend on developments outside South Africa. One famous Prime Minister of South Africa, Jan Smuts, who was also quite involved in European politics during both of the world wars, and I think he also drafted the plan for the United Nations just after the war. Jan Smuts, he once said that the future of South Africa will also always be determined beyond our borders in the northern hemisphere, presumably. And, to some extent, this entire revolution here has happened because of outside interference, especially from Europe and the United States, through imposing sanctions on us and treating us as an outcast or a pariah among nations. And I would say if say Donald Trump had to come to power in the US and maybe one or two conservative leaders could come to power in Europe, that will improve our chances of actually rallying together here and trying to change the course we're on and to stand up again for what we believe in. But there is a certain resilience also among us here. I think we have a history of being pioneers and having, surmounted almost insuperable obstacles in the past, and having, especially in the 19th century, having lived through all sorts of calamities and wars and deprivation and so on. The scorched earth policy of the British in this country, and we've managed to recover from that and rebuild the country within about 50 years or so. So, I think we have the ability, at least, to do it. The question is to find the will to survive and to prosper once more.
Yeah, that's the bit that worries me. Because of political correctness and all the other things that you have spoken about, feminism, homosexuality, all of those things that to me are pretty evil. Now, because of that, our will, it has been eroded. And because of the courses that you've spoken about in universities, and at schools now too, where you're being taught that the white is just so wicked. I mean, the fact that you were born white immediately makes you a bad person. Because of all of that, where do we get the will en masse? Not just a few of us, en masse. How do we make the people see and stand up against this? Because even in South Africa, where these horrors are happening to you daily, there are people, white people, who deny it. They just refuse to see it. So how do you get them to stand together?
Yes, I suppose you could call those people journalists. Yeah, but what's quite amazing here is that you've got all these liberal journalists who write their comments and their stories and so on, and then if you look at the commentary sections on the internet, it's always the exact opposite of what the journalists are writing. So I think out there, people are far more rational probably than we are giving them credit for. It's just that the entire power structure has now been, it's been taken over by these really left-wing, politically correct people, and by the corrupt black politicians. So people are waiting for some sort of a cue, and that's what I'm saying. If we could have some developments outside that will give people some hope here, then it could change fairly quickly. And I think even at universities, because the average white student is also surrounded by the reality of incompetent and corrupt government, violence on the streets, anarchy and crime. This stuff that he has to learn in his course, he sees it immediately for what it is. There's just this kind of liberal fantasy imported from overseas, and if he wants to get his degree, he's going to have to pretend that he believes in it. But I think outside the classroom, they scoff at it, and they realize that it's not the reality at all. So there is a kind of a constant reality check here, which you may not have in some other countries elsewhere in the world. I think there are parts of the United States where people live in a kind of an environment that's more or less purely Western, and they're sort of far from Detroit or
Yes.
Newark or any New Orleans or any of these places. So they can, it's easy enough for them to kind of believe in this fantasy of multiculturalism and equality, and
It's
that
not staring them in the face and hitting them in the head every day.
Exactly, and here, it just hits you all the time. You can't get away from it. It's always there. So we've got a constant reality check around us. So for that reason, I think people are much more, they tend to be much more rational in a lot of the decisions that they take, and the way they look at things. Except, of course, for these people in their sort of ivory towers, but even at newspapers, the editors of the newspapers might have this. They might follow the dominant ideology, but even if you speak to some of the individual journalists, privately they'll tell you, actually, I agree with you. I'm just not allowed to write it in my paper. So at some point, if there's some sort of deus ex machina, it could change overnight. Like we saw in Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall fell. Up until the last few weeks before that, nobody. It looked as if the wall would be there for another few hundred, forever, for another 100 years, and then just suddenly happened.
Well, we're running out of time, and I've saved the most important question for last, Dan. How does a minority survive in a hostile world?
Yes, I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and I think in my little book that I wrote a couple of years ago, The Scourge of the ANC, where I talked about this calamity that is befallen us in South Africa. Somewhere in there, I say that, the whites here are about 9% of the population, but that is mirrored by the fact that people of European descent are about 9% of the world population. So we are, wherever we go, we're in a minority.
Yes.
And you've got to find a model to survive in a world like that, where you are, at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, whites were 25% of the world population. So 1 out of every 4 people on the planet was somebody of European descent. Now it's 1 out of every 10 and going down. So in history, there's the example of the Spartans, who were also heavily outnumbered by the Helots around them. And they had a certain culture where they were fairly military oriented. They were stoic people, hardened and patriotic, and so on. And I think we're going to have to find some sort of Spartan model to survive. And I think we used to have it in this country until fairly recently. We were fairly hardy people. We grew up on farms, and we quite sports-minded. All the boys play a rough game like rugby, and we were good athletes, and we run endurance races, and even now I'm a bit of a cyclist, and my youngest son and I, we go on these cycle races and so on, and you need some, you need a bit of courage and endurance to go through something like that, and you've got to be physically and mentally strong, and that's what we'll have to do, and this sort of soft life that we've had for a large part of the 20th century, of the consumer society and sort of being a couch potato and just watching TV all day and, living in a very safe, cocooned kind of world, that's coming to an end. And we're going to have to live more like Spartans. We're going to have to exercise every day and defend ourselves and also depend on our community. We're going to have to rediscover community and standing together with other people, because just as individuals, we're not going to make it, because the other people out there, they've got a sense of togetherness and of solidarity, intra-group solidarity. If you look at these riots taking place on the campuses now in South Africa, there are just these mobs, and they all stand together. And if you're just an individual confronting them, you're definitely going to come off second best.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always said that we could learn a lot from the Black Ubuntu type of mentality, because they get things done by standing up together and having one huge voice, whereas we whites don't do that. We just don't.
Yes, it's something we're going to have to think about very hard. Just over dinner tonight, we were talking about the same thing, and my daughter is very interested in Oriental cultures and Japan and Korea and countries like that. She was saying that over there, it's seen, individualism is seen as something, as a weakness, because the person who's an outsider, he's actually too weak to form part of the group, and conforming to the group is actually seen as a strength.
And the show is coming to an end.
Okay.
I'd like to thank you very, very much, and to ask everybody to join us again next week, same time. After every show, I get emails from people that tell me that they would love to help the destitute, dispossessed white South Africans, but that they either do not know how or lack the means to do anything significant. Well, this is how anyone can contribute to saving white lives and bringing them to freedom. The cost of getting one white South African out of that hellhole and bringing them to the USA is about $3,000. Not a lot of money to save a life, but definitely not an amount that most of us can give at one time. However, every one of us can give $10 or $20 to this literally life or death cause. So please, think of the satisfaction of knowing that you helped to save a life, and donate the best amount you can afford to our PayPal account, cooks595@yahoo.com. That is Charlie, Oscar, Kilo, Sugar, 595@yahoo.com. You will be glad that you did.